joining. I call to order the meeting of the Budget and Business Services Committee for Wednesday, May 12th, which was postponed from May 5th. And thank you again to the public for understanding and as we adjusted to this new date, rescheduled. Ms. Costco, please note the committee members that are present and
Yes.
additional commissioners as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. And welcome to Chief Wallace, Deputy Superintendent Lee, Executive Directors Gordon and Diaz, and to our legal counsel and district staff, and of course, members of the public. There are no action items for this afternoon, but we do have 4 informational items to hear, 3 of which are standing items for our budget and business services. And at this time, under general information, you will find the notice regarding virtual meetings, which provides information on how the public can view, listen, and speak at board meetings. There is also information on ADA accommodations and translation services offered. So at this time, we will have our first item, which is the Public Education Enrichment Fund Expenditure Plan Update. I believe we'll have Director Diaz or Chief Wallace.
You have to, yeah.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Megan. Go ahead, Chief Wallace.
Oh no, please, Edwin. Sorry, I just Director Diaz wanted to make sure that you were there. I hadn't quite spotted you, so yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Awesome. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Edwin Diaz, the Director of the Public Education and Enrichment Fund, also known as PEEF, and it's my pleasure to provide you with an update this afternoon. Thank you again for letting us go first. We do have a committee advisory meeting after this one, which everyone is welcome to also to attend. You can find that information on our website on the school district page. So next slide. So I wasn't sure if we were going to have some new commissioners attending, so I built in this slide here to give a little information around PEEF. So as many of you may know, PEEF was approved by the San Francisco voters in 2004 through Proposition H, and again in 2014 through Proposition C. PEEF provides critical funding to SFUSD and the San Francisco Office of Early Care of Education. The law divides PEEF funding into 3 portions. The first third supports the Office of Early Care and Education, and then SFUSD receives the other 2 portions. The second third supports sports, libraries, arts and music, or SLAM, which is the acronym we use for that. And the third supports other general uses, or OGU, within SFUSD, which provides funding for programs such as ethnic studies, multilingual pathways, and student support professionals, which are our social workers and our nurses. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, when you have a chance. Sure. Awesome. Thank you. I wanted to share with you an overview of the expenditure plan development process this year and where we currently stand. Next slide. So earlier this year, we reached out to the mayor and controllers' offices and asked if we could adjust our deliverable date, which is stated by the law as April 1st, and move it to June 2021. This was due to COVID-related issues. We had to make adjustments due to the pandemic, and it also allowed us to align the PEEF budgeting process, which normally takes place in the fall, and align it with the overall district's process, which takes place in the spring. So that's why you're seeing experiencing some of the changes that you're seeing now, which is normally this process would be happening in the spring, but we've adjusted it so that we could have that better alignment. And so that's why we're coming now a little bit later in the spring. These changes resulted in better alignment and efficiency throughout the district budgeting process. Nevertheless, to comply with the law, we have sent a brief memo to the city regarding the upcoming expenditure plan and when they can expect it. Next slide, please. Thank you. As you can see at the top of the slide in the green boxes, we receive quarterly estimates from the city. We've already received the first 3 of those estimates, and we expect one more in June. Currently, program managers have already completed their program proposals for this for the next year. And the PFCAC has reviewed, it's completed its review process and is currently developing its recommendations for the board and the superintendent. Following that, the superintendent will complete a final review of the expenditure plan and submit it to the board for its review at the end of this month. There are some upcoming board meetings where PIF will be present, and that is the May 25th regular board meeting where we'll have first reading. Then that'll be followed by a June 15th committee of the whole, where the PFCAC and the PIF staff will give a presentation to the board. And then we will have second reading at the regular June 22nd regular board meeting. Next slide. So now I wanted to provide you with an overview of the PIF finances. As you can see in these slides, PIF revenues for both fiscal years 2021 and 21-22 have declined. You can see that our June estimate for 2021 was at one point as high as $7.6 million and has subsequently declined to $69.5 million. For fiscal year 21-22, at one point we were as high as $79.5 million, and that's subsequently been reduced to $75 million. Largely, this is because our finances, PIF finances, are connected to the city's finances. So as the overall health of the city goes, so do the PIF revenues. Excuse me. So we are seeing these declines because the city's revenues are experiencing those declines. We receive a portion of the city's aggregated discretionary revenues, so things like sales tax and transfer taxes. And so as those things have been in decline, we've seen our revenues decline. Next slide, please. There is some good news on the horizon, and that is that the city is projecting in its 5-year projections that PIF revenue will increase over the next few years. So we can see that those revenues will begin to increase starting next fiscal year for fiscal year 21-22, and will potentially grow as high as $100 million for fiscal year 25-26. So good news on that front. Next slide, please. We wanted to share a little information also on the we also want to share a little information on the PIF baseline appropriations. This is also part of the city charter, which enacted PIF. And these were revenues that the city was receiving prior to the law being enacted, and then was rolled up into the law. And it shows that this slide shows the revenue projections for the baseline contribution. The city of San Francisco provides discretionary general fund revenues to SFUSD through its PIF baseline. These baseline appropriations are separate from the city's annual fund contribution, the larger contribution that we described in those two second, third, and third earlier. This funding source also provides funds to the arts and the athletics department, as well as other programs within the district. So as we can see on this slide, these funds also took a bit of a dive from this year. So we can see that last year we were as high as $11.4 million, and this year that estimate was reduced to $9.7 million. And so there is good news here, and that the revenues will increase also the same way the annual allocation is increasing over the next 5 years. But we'll talk a little bit more about this slide and why we wanted to present this information in future slides. Next slide. So this slide shows how the district is dividing the fiscal year 21-22 annual allocation of that $75 million that we saw in an earlier slide. We've seen how we're dividing it amongst SLAM and OGU. As you can see, we are projected expenses are outpacing our revenue of $37 million for SLAM and $37 million for OGU. On the next slide, we will show a little bit of how we are planning to make adjustments for this reduction in revenue. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we'll start with this year, fiscal year 2021. And so to balance this year for the revenue reductions that we've received, we're going to be using some one-time funding. We're going to be using some one-time funding in the form of learning loss mitigation funds, and we're going to be shifting some OGU expenses onto those funding sources to the tune of about $3.7 million. This helps create strong alignment between PEEF programs and eligible uses for that funding. And it results in savings for PEEF OGU that'll be transferred to the Unrestricted General Fund, or UGF, to support the fiscal year 2021 balancing plan. Also, we talked a little bit about the baseline earlier, and so we're also going to be making an ongoing shift from the PEEF baseline onto the PEEF annual allocation. This allows the district to absorb the revenue loss to the PEEF baseline allocation, and expenses are all the expenses are SLAM related. Sorry, that movement over there shifted something on my screen. I apologize for laughing. So all expenses are SLAM related expenses: athletics, elementary arts, and elementary music. And the shifts will be covered by the SLAM fund balance, of which is currently at $8.5 million, until the PEEF revenue increases as anticipated in the city's 5-year financial outlook. Next slide, please. So these are some anticipated changes that we hope to make to the portfolio for fiscal year 21-22, to sort of meet our revenue that's coming in. So as you can see, we just spoke about making those shifts from the baseline allocation onto the annual allocation. So you'll see that the athletics department and the arts department's budgets have grown by those amounts that used to be on the PEEF baseline, increasing the overall SLAM portion to $40 million. But we will be using some fund balance to cover those, so the increase. So you'll see at the bottom we have here where it says sources, you'll see that we have the revenue estimate of $37 million that we receive in the annual allocation. And then we'll be using a one-time fund balance amount of $2.2 million, and that will cover those shifts from the baseline. And then we'll be using an additional $600,000 to maintain the SLAM programs at the revenue allocation that we received in November and December. Because we have SLAM balance that we can use, and we want to be able to maintain the programming that those directors and managers have already planned for fiscal year 21-22. So after all of that is said and done, we will have a fund balance remaining of about $3.4 million. For OGU, we'll be making adjustments to our MTSS and student support professional budgets, and making shifts on those programs. So those programs will still be funded. So all of their programming will be funded. It just won't all be funded on PEEF the way it currently is now. So you'll see that those amounts have decreased from the previous slide. So academic MTSS is now at around $14 million on PEEF, and student support professionals has gone down to about $12 million on PEEF. But again, I strongly want to state that those other portions will be funded. It just won't be funded on PEEF. And then that'll bring the OGU portion to meet our revenue of about $37.9 million. Next slide. We have some other anticipated changes for 21-22 that we wanted to share. There are a few more, but we just wanted to give some highlights. So for the arts department, we will be able, as I mentioned earlier, we will be able to maintain programming based according to their revenue estimate. However, we will not be able to incorporate the growth for program staff that was outlined in the arts resolution due to the PEEF revenue loss. For academic MTSS, we were able to grow the overall portion of academic MTSS that we previously had on PEEF we were able to increase that amount. And as I stated earlier, we're still going to be making some of those shifts, but even with that shift to other sources, we still are taking on a greater amount of academic MTSS onto PEEF. We had a program on PEEF called Enhanced Social and Emotional Supports, and we've shifted that from PEEF to other funding sources. Ethnic studies, we were funding about 16 sections of ethnic studies on PEEF, and with 2 other sections being funded through the unrestricted general fund. And we have shifted those 2 that were on the unrestricted general fund onto PEEF so that all of the current ethnic studies sections are now fully funded by PEEF. This does not include the expansion that was approved by the board in a couple months ago or a couple of weeks ago to expand ethnic studies curriculum. Then for multilingual pathways, we needed to make an adjustment to their funding due to the loss in revenue for PEEF, and which may have impact, which the program has let us know may have an impact on world language programs for TK through 12 programming. We wanted to mention this one because I know this is a frequent item that comes up at board meetings. As I've watched, there are folks who are very interested in how world language programs are growing in the district. And so we just wanted to highlight that there may be an impact. The program is still working to see how they're going to adjust to their new allocation. And as we have more details, we'll be able to share that with you in the future. And then we wanted to highlight student support professionals. This is our social workers and our nurses, and they largely receive funding for social workers and nurses. They have little funding left. After all is said and done, they have little funding left for materials, supplies, professional development, and other department needs. We were hoping this year for next year, for 21-22, to be able to grow their budget slightly to give them an increase to be able to have those non-FTE dollars. Unfortunately, it does not look like we'll be able to accommodate that given the declining revenue. So we wanted to highlight that it's not that we're losing staff here for student support professionals, but they're not able to do anything extra because the majority of their funding goes straight to supporting our social workers and our nurses. All right, and next slide. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation and thank you. And I'll send, after public comment, I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Edwin. At this time, any clarifying questions from commissioners before I go to public comment? And then we can go into discussion. And speak up in case I don't see your hands. I don't think so. Let's go ahead, Deborah, go to public comment, please.
So the first person, actually, we have 4 speakers, Commissioner.
All right, let's go up to 2 minutes per speaker, please.
2 minutes, okay. All right.
Hi, it's Lainey Matomedy from the PEEF CAC co-chair. Thank you so much for the presentation, Edwin, and we'll see you shortly at 5:30. And I just am wanting to comment because some of these changes are changes that have come after the fact and did not come before the PEEF CAC as far as the movements this year and going forward. They're not ones that we've provided input into. And I also want to, which is an ongoing issue that we've raised as a CAC. And I also want to mention that as far as the SLAM programs are concerned, we entered this academic year with athletics and PE, both having over $3 million in accumulated unspent funds. And we know that some of those accumulations have come from cost savings measures due to COVID, and kids aren't actually receiving those funds or programs right now. And so as we look at future allocations and how we're budgeting, I'd like to applaud Commissioner Alexander and Commissioner Sanchez for bringing up the issue of baseline and where we're starting and where we're going. PEEF has been in place since 2004. And when I look at these programs and the approved allocations versus the actual expenditures, I'm not seeing alignment on a regular basis. It's easier to follow the money around sports, libraries, arts, and music programming because that's dedicated funding. And I'm seeing regular modifications and movement in expenditures as compared to where the approved allocations are. And this affects how we fund arts equity resolution. It also affects what kind of athletics and PE programs our students are actually getting versus what is communicated on paper of what they're supposed to be getting. So, yeah.
Thank
Our
you.
next speaker is Beth Kelly.
Yeah, hi, my name is Beth Kelly. I just had a quick comment on this, and it's just more in light of the bigger budget pictures. It seems like there's going to be a use of kind of like reserve funds in order to spend in the coming year. And it might be a good question of, especially since those are like there's a portion of those that are unrestricted, whether it makes sense to kind of keep those reserves to cushion the blow of kind of like the future year shortfalls. It's just a thought of how you're using these funds in the context of like the bigger picture. Thank you.
Okay. Next speaker is Julie Roberts Fung.
Hi, thank you to the PFCAC and to Mr. Diaz for the thorough presentation and the challenges that y'all have been wrestling with in this difficult fiscal year. I wanted to thank Mr. Diaz for raising the issue of language pathways. In looking at the PEEF budget, it looks like, unless I'm reading this incorrectly, that there are not middle school teachers allocated for the Vietnamese and Arabic language pathways. Which means that those programs, those pathways will not be completed in alignment with the resolution. And I want to advocate for the language pathways the funding to be maintained and the efforts to maintain staffing in those roles, to hire where we haven't hired and to maintain staffing where there are other pathways that have already been established. As you know, folks have probably heard at lots of different board meetings, the language pathways, if not taken good care of, are left to atrophy. Those are really difficult positions to fill. So I want to advocate for the board to really ensure that the FTE for those programs is funded and that we continue to support the multilingual department in hiring and maintaining staff, not just for Arabic and Vietnamese language pathways, but for all of our pathways. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Doug Sill.
Thank
Doug?
you very much. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate the time and appreciate Mr. Diaz's thorough presentation of kind of the budget situation and shortfall. I'm here actually just to introduce myself. I promise to take less than 2 minutes as the kind of husband of a second grade teacher in the East Bay and father of 2 kids, listening to budget shortfalls for many, many years. As a byproduct, I've been encouraged to take on a passion project where we support schools as a nonprofit and really an effort to be able to fund back to the schools, which I know is a very different conversation that typically happens in these meetings. So the concept behind it is that we work with schools to leverage their brand. So all the spirit wear, for example, for each school, currently working with San Jose Unified and Berkeley Unified School Districts, and 100% of the profits go back to the individual schools. We found that it's best to work with the district level because, to be candid, the principals, PTA are very busy. And really, I just want to introduce the concept and ask for support of the SF Unified School District Board to be able to offer this free service to everybody and help where we can. You know, an average school earns around $5,000 a year in fundraising back to school. And if elected, the board or the district can obviously keep that funding at the district level, which would come to a few $100,000 based on the schools in your district. So again, just want to introduce myself, here to help. I'm currently working with San Ramon and Berkeley Unified, and would love to be able to work with SF.
Thank you. Commissioner, I think there are no further speakers on this item.
Thank you, Ms. Costco. So at this
you.
time, I'd like to open up for discussion amongst commissioners. Any questions for Director Diaz or for Chief Wallace? Commissioner Sanchez?
Thank you, Commissioner Lamb. Just maybe, Edwin, if you could go over a little bit about a couple things. One, just the process that you engaged the CAC with in getting to your results and recommendations for the board, and then to address Laney's concern around essentially funds being shifted from one line item to another. It sounds like that's obviously been an ongoing issue, but just to, if you could address it here, that'd be great.
Definitely. Thank you for those questions. So let's start with the first part, which is how the CAC develops their recommendations. So the beginning at the beginning of the school year, the CAC engages in an annual long process of learning about the P-funded programs. They often invite P-funded programs to come visit with them and give presentations. This year, we actually took that a step further and asked all the programs to come and meet with the CAC members who were reading their proposals and just actually spend some time, answer questions. They spent about a half hour with each group, and that was well received. We had some technical glitches, I will say, on that meeting, but overall it went pretty well. At the same time, CAC members also read proposals for all the P-funded programs. They do it through work groups. So each work group is assigned 2 to 3 proposals that they read, and they work to become mini experts in those programs that they read, and then they share that information, their thoughts, their impressions on how those programs are doing based on those proposals with each other. And then they develop each work group develops recommendations that they present to the larger work group. And then those are voted on by the larger body as recommendations that they want to submit to the board and the superintendent. Their today's meeting, to just finish that point off, today's meeting is where they're going to make a final decision on what the memo looks like, and then we will upload that to board docs and share that with the board and the superintendent for first reading. In terms of Laney's question, she brings up a valid point. We met with the CAC last month, and Chief Wallace came and gave a presentation on some of these potential shifts that could take place in PEEF next year. And this issue did come up, and as part of the conversation where many CAC members felt like this was the first time they were seeing that information about the fund balance. And I will say that the conversation focused largely around the uses of the fund balance. The CAC members get information on what we're going to do annually with the annual allocation, but there is this question of that they're not getting information on what happens with the fund balance. And we recognize that as a staff that there is a gap there that we need to close. We need to do a better job of informing the CAC of potential uses for the fund balance on a regular basis, whether it's bi-monthly or quarterly. We need to come back and say, this is what we're proposing, this is what we're thinking. Give us your thoughts, in the form of a recommendation, or in real time, give us your thoughts about that. So we hear Laney's the concern that Laney brought up for the CAC, and we're going to be working to close that gap in the future.
Can you, since this has been an ongoing issue, I feel like at least every year, every other year, it's brought up by members of the committee. How would you operationalize what you're suggesting? What will it look like for them to actually feel and know that they're part of this type of decision making?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, so we've heard this, this item come up in different forms. So if we looked at past recommendations, the CAC has asked for just more information on how the district is using their funding. And as a staff, what we've incorporated is regular updates at each CAC meeting on how we're doing financially, revenue estimates, where we're going. What we haven't done is exactly what Laney pointed out, which is we haven't really brought up, shared with them information on the use of the fund balance. It hasn't been on our part, sort of, I don't want folks to take away like we don't want to share with them what we're doing with the fund balance. It's more like we just haven't done a very good job of, once we made a decision and we take an action, going back and saying to them, or even before we take that action, going to the CAC and saying, this is what we're thinking. So the way we want to close that gap is by building those updates into our already monthly updates that we provide to the CAC at each meeting, and saying, okay, we know that we want to, for example, make this shift in SLAM. We want to mention that at the next CAC meeting before we take that step. So I think that's the way the team and I have had this discussion since this has come up. Our thinking about it is that making sure that we build this in, that anytime, every month, whereas we're preparing our financial update for the CAC, making sure that if there's any shifts that we're thinking about, that those are included in that meeting's update.
My last question is around, thank you, Edwin, is around what programs in the recent past have been discontinued that the committee has found that the program doesn't have efficacy, or it's just not a good fit for our district?
That's a great question. And I think hopefully if Lainey's still there, I would welcome her input if I'm saying something that she doesn't feel is right. But in the last 3 years, I have not seen or heard from the CAC that there's a program that should not be on PEEF. My general sense is that we have good alignment between what is currently funded through PEEF and the use of the intended use of those dollars. So we needed to make some shifts last year because of loss to revenue, but those programs were shifted to other funding sources within the district. But largely, it wasn't because the CAC made a recommendation that those programs should not be funded on PEEF. Again, my sense is that people feel like the programs that are currently funded are good uses of the funding, and so we haven't heard that this year.
And just to follow up on that, is there a specific evaluation process? I know that you mentioned that there's essentially subcommittees or committees that become specialized in the programs that they're reviewing, but is there an actual evaluation process for each of the programs that we have funded by PEEF?
That's great questions. So we do have an evaluation process. We suspended that evaluation process this year for a couple of reasons. One, due to COVID, it was just really difficult to give a proper evaluation of last year when programs kind of ended, abruptly. And at the same time, we saw that as an opportunity to really revamp our evaluation process. For those commissioners who haven't been here, we produce an annual evaluation report, but we've gotten feedback from both the board and from the CAC that it really wasn't a good tool to give an impression of how the programs were performing. And so our manager of research and evaluation, Dr. Christopher Lee, has been working this year to revamp our evaluation process, to model it with a results-based accountability model and a continuous improvement model that the district has in place. And we hope to produce a report in the beginning of the school year for 2021 that will show the results of that evaluation process.
Okay, and Commissioner Lamb, if it's okay with you, could we allow Lainey to respond if she'd like to?
Yes, thank you. I'm not a co-host, so if Lainey, if you would like to provide additional comment, I think you're allowed to talk. You're permitted to provide remarks.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Yes, great.
Thanks for the opportunity to clarify. As far as Commissioner Sanchez, your first question that you posed regarding recommendations that the PEEF has made to move programs off, I would concur. I don't recall a time where we've said a program ought not to be on the CAC since I've been here, or on the PEEF, but I can think of instances where we felt like the efficacy wasn't clear, that we wanted more information. about who was being served, the purpose of the program, how they were measuring their goals, just more information to feel confident that the program was being funded to the spirit of the PIF and being adequately reviewed and assessed and measured. So I can think of a few examples from that. And those will come to you when we make, if there is an issue, those will typically come to the board with our recommendations. That said, I do want to say we don't have a whole lot of say-so of what shows up, right? So what we see is what the superintendent is proposing that's going to be on PIF. So for instance, this year, quite a few programs were moved off of PIF funding for reasons that I'm sure Chief Wallace has explained because of all the budget issues. And also my understanding from her presentation to the CAC that it was also to streamline. There was a bunch of MTSS funding that was put on PIF that had typically funded part of that, but there was an idea of funding more through PIF so it could be managed and reviewed in one place, for example. But that doesn't necessarily come from the CAC. We receive the superintendent's proposals and we review them as such. And then to your second question about how the process that we use to review them, we do have a narrative template that each program has to fill out that does talk about its goals, its purpose, who it's targeting, how they measure success, some narrative, and then also a budget allocation description. And we have recently started asking just this year for what unspent funds do you have from last year? And what that raised was we'd had suspicions and concerns that we'd raised. And then when you actually see the unspent funds, and frankly, it's again easier to track from our sports, library, arts, and music because those funds have to stay aligned with the SLAM programs. Whereas OGU, those funds can disappear understandably and go elsewhere, and that's totally fine with the PIF city charter language, but we don't necessarily as a CAC get to see why those unspent funds occurred. Is it because that the program was more effective and efficient? Was it because they couldn't hire people? Or was it because they weren't doing what they ought to be doing? So these are all the kinds of things. And then we do have a rubric. We break into work groups, and we're attempting over the last, it's really just been 2 years, maybe 3, that we've had these work groups in an attempt to develop some depth of knowledge, especially since our CAC membership can change over time, so that there's a continuity in understanding of these programs. But again, we have different programs potentially each year other than SLAM. So that is a very long answer, and certainly nothing that I would ever say in a 2-minute comment piece, but hopefully it gets to what you're bringing up. But I do want to say one more thing since I have a little bit of airtime. As an example of what I'm talking about, actual allocation or approved allocations versus actual expenditures. For instance, Q1 of athletic spending this year was $75,000. Last year, it was $198,000 for obvious reasons. There are no athletics happening for most of our students. So when we think about these allocations, I am aligned with what Chief Wallace is trying to do with zero-based budgeting. I am aligned with what the attempts are being made around baseline and Vision 2025. But I also want to point out that these are programs, these allocations, when they don't get spent, I think you can assume it's because students aren't getting services or they're not receiving the programs as approved and by the CAC and by this board and as proposed by the superintendent. For me to see that year over year, especially around SLAM programs, which have been in place since 2004, we ought to have a lot to talk about as far as what we're doing K through 12 and who we're serving and why we're serving them and the pathways. We should be able to tell all sorts of great stories. And there's something that doesn't pass the smell test that we're now 17 years later and we cannot. and this predates COVID. This predates the pandemic. We're in a bigger world of hurt now, but this is not because of the pandemic. So with that, I conclude.
Thank you, Lainey.
Thank you, Lainey. President Lopez?
Hi, thank you. I appreciate Commissioner Sanchez. You asked a lot of similar questions. So I just wanted to hear a little more about the extension in reporting and how it's actually more aligned to what we're doing. Is that going to continue moving forward, or is this just the situation because of the pandemic?
Sorry, Commissioner Lopez. Okay, could you explain a little more about the extension part? Sorry.
Yeah, and in your presentation, there was a sense that you asked the city to sort of give the PFAC more time, but that ended up being more aligned to our timeline. So just wondering if that's going to stay moving forward.
That's a great question. It is our hope as a PIF office budget team, the budget office, the CFO, I think we're all in agreement that we would like to see this as a permanent change because it really did create a lot of alignment and efficiency in the district budgeting. In prior years, when we do the PIF budgeting in the fall and then do the district budgeting in the spring, programs really don't have a sense of what their overall total budget is when they're preparing the PIF budget. And so what happens is they kind of do their best guesstimation, the best educated guess they can in preparing the PIF budgets. But then they kind of have to, take that into account when they've then moved into the spring and they're preparing their overall district budget. So go back and say, hey, what did I say in that PIF budget? Oh yes, we said we would do this. Well, I might have made a different choice. I often hear from program directors, I might have made a different choice had I seen the whole budget at the same time. So to answer your question, we hope we can continue to speak with our city partners and make this a permanent change where we can submit, a small brief in April to comply with the law, but submit the overall spending plan, at a later date when the district budgeting has taken place, and we can keep this as a permanent practice.
Okay, that's good to hear. And I know we're making note of a lot of the things we've learned over the past year that have actually benefited us. So that'll add on to the list that we have. Thank you.
Commissioner Alexander?
Thanks. Yeah, just to follow up, I would love to hear, Mr. Diaz, if you have thoughts on what Lainey was saying around the unspent money, meaning less services to kids, because that is, kind of concerning if there's large amounts that are unspent. It does make sense to me that board is sort of approving this and saying, okay, we're going to spend X million dollars on athletics or on arts, and it's my understanding is it's supposed to be supplemental, right? I mean, the whole idea is that it's above and beyond, and so yeah, I guess I'd just like to hear more about your thoughts on that, and like what's our internal process for kind of accountability around that?
So great questions. As Lainey points out, there's various reasons why money goes unspent, from a staff person not being employed or a position not being filled. It could be that someone left and we hired a new employee, but that employee cost a little bit less. So that's a difference that then contributes to unspent money. It could be that a contractor, we shifted contractors, and now that money, the new contract costs a little bit less than the old contractor. And so it all kind of adds up. Another contributor are charter schools. We give a charter school an estimate each year based on, each charter school receives an allocation each year based on what we anticipate they're going to be spending on. So for example, they get an allocation for a librarian, they get an allocation for any nurse or social worker, they get an allocation for PE. And so some years our charter school partners, they're great partners, so I don't want to make it seem like they're doing anything nefarious. But some years, for example, they don't fill their librarian role, or for some reason they don't have a PE teacher, and so or their principal is their PE teacher, but the principal doesn't meet the criteria for getting the PE allocation. Because he has to be a credentialed PE teacher to teach PE to receive the allocation, and if the principal fills that role, then they're not eligible for that allocation. So that will accumulate into the fund balance as well. So there's a lot that contributes, and it's little drops that each year contribute to that. And so I don't, and we can go in and do a little further analysis. We don't think that it's that, whole scale services are not being provided, but it's more smaller drops that are contributing to our fund balance kind of growing.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I guess I was kind of really interested in the process for accountability around it rather than Dick's. That totally makes sense. I guess my question, it sounds like the CAC is not receiving like a budget to actuals report, or do they receive that information? And how, I guess what I meant was like sort of on an ongoing basis, how is there a process for kind of checking to see why that's happening? And then ensuring, because to me, it seems like a part of the accountability in terms of checks and balances would be that, right? Because otherwise you get a situation where, and I'm not saying this would ever happen, but if you hold back the art spending, then you end up with money that you can put into something else, right? And we want to make sure that it's going into arts, right? So now, if there's something unavoidable, like the examples you just gave, of course, but to me, that seems like exactly the role of the CAC is, oh, let's just make sure. Here's why $100,000 didn't get spent because X, Y, and Z happened at the charter school or whatever. And then it's just closing that loop around the accountability. So is there do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. Thank you for clarifying. I will say that I think it's an issue of frequency. I think we have given updates around the fund balance. We haven't done them enough. We need to do them more. So for example, last year, Chief Wallace came to the PCAC and gave a presentation on the use of the ERAF dollars that we have received from prior years. And she outlined a plan on how that money was going to be used for the district rebalancing. And so we gave that, it was early in the fall, and we gave that one-time update, and we should have maybe done another one. We should have done another one in the spring, or continue to update the CAC maybe quarterly, maybe bi-monthly on how that was taking place. We recognize now that we just haven't been doing it enough. Like doing it once is just not enough. We need to continue to be vigilant and reporting out. And we hear that concern, and we hear it, and we're going to make that improvement moving forward.
That's awesome. And I think the exciting thing to me is it's also an opportunity. I think what's in my opinion great about the PFCAC also is it sort of can be a model for how we do transparency and accountability in the district at large, because we have this oversight. So maybe if we look at the oversight as this opportunity to create processes that are hopefully not overly burdensome, but just like you said, just become a regular practice. And then I think, and then when we do things like shifting the funds, like I was at the last CAC meeting briefly, and this idea of shifting the funds off of PEEF and the question of do they still have oversight, well, it'll become less of an issue if we just kind of have this practice of, yeah, we know we did shift those funds, here's why, and we know exactly where it went, and we can track it, and we can show you that. I think that's maybe just in terms of like for the whole budget team of as we move forward of thinking about how we can, so it doesn't become an additional burden, but we just have these processes built in where people from the public can just look and see it pretty easily. Real quick, thanks for letting me take so much time, but real quick, I just want to ask about the language pathways, because I heard Julie Roberts-Fung's comment about the Arabic and Vietnamese pathways. I've heard there may be some high school language cuts, and again, that's kind of concerning when we were trying to avoid school-based cuts this year. So I'm just curious what's going on with that, and are there ways that we could restore that funding? I mean, again, I think for the board has made really clear that we're prioritizing those school-based investments. And so, and it sounds like the CAC hasn't actually had time to review that yet. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but it'd be great to hear more about that.
So I won't go into too deep into the staffing parts that Ms. Roberts-Fung mentioned, largely because I think the better folks to speak to that are our programmatic partners, and we can definitely go back to them and ask that question about what's happening with the middle school teachers and why they might not being funded this next year. But what I can say from our conversation on the P side, we had a conversation with them when our revenue was reduced, and we made a recommendation to them, which they accepted, which was rather than lower staff, to lower their non-FTE. So lower things like materials and supplies. And that's where, and maybe I should have clarified that a little bit. That's where they're making those changes. That's where they're looking to make those changes, but they do recognize that, that will have impact on the language programs because, for example, they won't be able to order materials to support those programs if they have to, make those adjustments because of the revenue. But I can look into further. I can go back to them and ask them that question about the middle school teachers and follow up and send a follow up to the board.
That'd be great. And then one more quick thing, I really appreciate it. And one more quick thing, what I'm hearing by text from someone is that the CAC has actually not received the approved to actuals number. So I just want to make that formal request if we can start giving them on a regular basis. And maybe I don't know, could we start by just, looking at last year and this year, just even to me, again, this shouldn't be that hard to run a report to say, what was our budget and what were the actual expenditures, right? Like that seems like something we could give them pretty easily. So I would hope we could do that.
Thank you for bringing that up. I meant to mention. Go ahead, Megan, if you wanna respond.
I just wanted to, thanks Edwin, I just wanted to share that the PEEF office does prepare quarterly reports. That is actually regular part of the information that they share out. So just in case there was any sense that there wasn't information provided, I think one thing that we do need to check on is just making sure that we are adequately building in the fund balance assumptions as opposed to and use of that fund balance. Sorry, my cat won't leave me alone. So I just wanted to say that up front, but Edwin, please, what were you gonna say?
Oh, I was gonna say exactly what you were gonna say. And I would add that to recognize that we have been delayed in producing quarter two, sending quarter two out to the quarter two report. They're one of the shifts that we talked about, moving some of those that I showed in the presentation of shifting the learning loss mitigation funds. We're having a hard time kind of showing that so that it doesn't appear like we're double counting it. So we're working with our accounting partners, our accounting department partners to kind of how to reflect that. So we show it as an actual shift versus, showing it as being there counted twice, even though it's being paid for by the learning loss. As soon as we can rectify that, we'll share that out with our CAC members and the board and all our other partners.
Thank you. Commissioner Moliga, Vice President Moliga.
Thank you, Chair Lamb. Thank you, Edwin, for the report. I just wanted to focus my comments really around sports and athletics, and kind of just there was a couple of things that I wanted to get. I wanted to see if someone could pull me, and you guys could send this to me later. I wanted to get an idea of what folks were spending in that department in terms of like items. I think sports had taken a huge hit this year and last year, and it's moving into the reopening in the fall, and how we create programs moving forward. I think it's an area that is going to be a place we should highly invest in, especially around the health and wellness, social emotional, and how much it does for school culture. And so I'm curious to know if someone could pull me those items. And I really want to see if we could dive deep into our athletics and figure out how to put money in there so we could build up the program and make it even stronger. Really curious to know what a K through 12 athletic program in SFUSD would look like. And so I don't know if you had any comments around that. I know that the funds have increased for 21-22. I was wondering if those funds were just being poured in there, and the program staff are going to figure out how to allocate those, or were they allocated in there with intentionality to serve a purpose?
Great question. Again, I won't go too deep into specifics because I think our athletic partners are the folks that can best speak to how the money's being used. I can say that, and I think we may or may not know this, but because COVID, the athletics department was not conducting sports throughout the fall, and it wasn't until the spring that they were able to, fully begin implementing sports programming. And even that was in a limited capacity in terms of how students could practice, where they could practice, and how many games they could hold in which sports. And so you'll see in the first two quarterly reports, you're probably going to see that they have accumulated quite a large amount of unspent money. And it will probably, you'll see by the third quarterly report that money is starting to being spent more regularly because they were able to begin including those sports and beginning those sports. And so I can get you that report in terms of what sports took place in the spring and how those funds were being used, what referees, what coaches, what buses took place. I can work with the athletics department to get you that information.
That'd be great, Ed. If you could do me a favor, you could pull the last 3 years. That'd be awesome. Thank you.
And I think, go for it, Anne-Marie. I was going to say, you wanted to say something.
Yes, and Commissioner Maliga, at least when it comes to the current year, the board information request that we shared a couple of weeks ago does include everybody's budget and spending so far this year. So at least, so that also I think is another good place to look where some of that information is available. And I can follow up, or we can follow up via email to give you the just the specific instructions of in the report, which tab and how to navigate to where athletics lives and where PE lives. But I think even in terms of this current year, I think some of that information, that may be a good starting point as well.
Well, I appreciate that. Was that itemized? Is it itemized?
It would have been shared. It looks like it was an information request that we put together that Judson would have shared with you all. But it was your request about unspent balances.
I know what you're talking about, but I could take a look and we could chat offline for further questions. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you, commissioners. I did have a couple of follow-ups and requests. Going back to the language pathways, I would like to ask or request with board leadership if we can actually have a multi-language pathways presentation, perhaps at an upcoming COW, or as it's fitting to our schedule of our focus of returning to in-person, because I know since I sat on the PFCAC, which was several years ago, that we had seen decreasing, and sorry, my phone just won't stop beeping. They around the multi-language pathway, I know that they were going through some kind of, I want to use org restructuring, but analysis, and I think that would be helpful for the board, since maybe the slice of what P funds is, one component of it. People are talking about 8th grade graduation promotion. So apologies there. So that's one request, maybe with board leadership to work with the superintendent for consideration. I also checked in with my PFCAC appointees, and thank you, Lainey, for raising it, because I would say similarly with both of my appointees, that was a similar theme, and just in summary raised about just wanting to get more clarity around, what PEEF is funding, and, those balances, as well as just understanding more details of ensuring the intent and those funds are going to where we named. At the same time, I also want to give Chief Wallace a chance or to Director Diaz to to also give any additional context, because Chief Wallace and I did talk about it before the presentation, as something that I think will come forward. I'm assuming will formally come forward in the memo to come from the overall PFCAC. So perhaps I'll just allow time now for any responses to what was raised by the CAC.
Thanks, Commissioner Lamb. I can speak to it a little bit. I mean, I think overall, I just want to acknowledge that, and I did say this a minute ago, but I'll say it again, that we will be building in, reports on fund balance, making sure that it's really clear, our incoming revenue from the annual allocation, the available fund balances, that all of those pieces are together, and trying to just improve the clarity of the reporting. But I do want to be clear that we have been providing the reports, but we'll try to connect, the information so that we want the CAC clearly to feel like we're working to keep them informed and helping understand what's going on. But overall, as Director Diaz shared, we have had dips in our revenue, and with the PEEF baseline in particular, we needed to make adjustments that if we look back at the first interim report, there is a table that we provided showing some intention of shifting funds around to accommodate, that lost revenue, but also just overall the shift of the 3.7 million MTSS to the learning loss funds was part of our overall district strategy for balancing, that we had this one-time CARES funding source that really came in and saved the day for us. We were looking at massive cuts and talking about labor concessions. It was like this time last year was miserable. But then we got this one-time source. But part of that was that we were going to work to make those CARES dollars offset or cover our operating expenses. And that means identifying current operating expenses that align well with that funding source. And that's what that 3.7 million in the PEEF OGU is. Those MTS dollars fit very nicely with the learning loss mitigation funds. So I just want to be really clear that while it feels strange to move funds around, it was part of our overall strategy for balancing our budget this year. And so far, we've been largely successful being able to cover costs. But then also with the PEEF SLAM movement, we have lost funds on the PEEF baseline. We're trying to move expenses over to that SLAM fund balance because that is an eligible use of those funds. But again, we need to bring the PEEF CAC along with that more effectively. So we are going to be working to do that. But I do want to speak to one public comment about that fund balance. We've been very careful not to mix fund balance between PEEF OGU and SLAM, that if it's SLAM fund balance, it stays with SLAM. So if we're seeing savings in athletics, music, arts, it may not all, if it's savings in athletics, we're not necessarily saying it's going to go back to athletics. I think that's one thing that maybe we should talk about, but we can't reserve those funds to cover a reserve for our operating budget. That's a really important distinction for us to make. And I would just say that the district fiscal team is working to make sure that we're meeting all of the requirements of the PEEF dollars as mapped out in the city charter. So sorry, I hope that wasn't more than you were hoping for, Commissioner Lamb, but that's, yeah.
No, I think it's important to have your, perspective and explain the rationale and where we've been over the last, particularly year and a half, especially with COVID and the ever kind of shifting, right, of our fiscal and budget situation. So I just wanted to give you that space and to give further explanation. So thank you to the PEEF CAC and thank you to the PEEF team. I know that you're just going to hop off and then hop right back into your CAC meeting. So thank you to Director Diaz. So we'll conclude our PEEF informational item. We look forward to the next, I think in 2 weeks, we'll see you again for a formal presentation there. So at this time, we are going to move into our second item, which is our standing item, the fiscal year 2021, the Budget and Business Services Committee calendar. And Director Anne Marie Gordon's going to walk us through that.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Lamb. And I am ready for the slide deck when you are. Great. And so I guess this is a little bit of a repeat from last week, because I did present the item before we decided to postpone. But as Commissioner Lamb said, this item is standing for each of our Budget and Business Services Committee meetings, to go over the calendar and just keep track of where we are in the year. You know, what we've covered, what we're focusing on today, and then what will be coming next month in our final meeting of the year. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Great. So here we have our summary of the agendas from each of our Budget and Business Services meetings over the course of the 2021 school year. This month, we have the PEEF expenditure plan, which we already heard, and then our updates on school reopening and revenue initiatives. Our final meeting of the year will consist primarily of kind of a preview of the budget book and the recommended budget and LCAP. One item that I realize is not there is an update on enrollment that I think we are hoping to put together to provide an update before the end of the school year. Next slide, please. So here we have the visual view of a couple of critical work streams for Budget and Business Services, primarily being the LCAP and budget development. You can see that, and I realize we also did not update this for today's date, but with the originally intended May 5th date, we have, you can see that we are really just in the midst of both finalizing the LCAP, preparing to receive and then respond to stakeholder recommendations. And we are in the final stages of our budget analysis and compilation, with only a few weeks to go before we are presenting that information publicly. Next slide, please. And finally, this slide is different. And this is just to bring back the timeline that includes both budget, LCAP, and our learning recovery planning. This was a slide that we presented at the Committee of the Whole last week. And so just wanted to bring it back because it does highlight, especially at the May 25th meeting and then through the end of June, that we have a number of meetings, a number of deliverables and timelines that are not always in perfect sync. So the kind of key example being that at the May 25th regular board meeting, we will hear the LCAP recommendations from the advisory committees, but we will also be presenting the Expanded Learning Opportunity Grant Plan for approval, which is due to the CDE by June 1st. So we have a few places where timing isn't as ideal as we would have envisioned, but we'll be working to really put the pieces together and make connections to make communication and kind of sharing of information as smooth as possible, in spite of places where the timeline doesn't allow us to make the process as smooth as possible. Next slide. Oh, okay, that's it. I think that is the last slide. I wasn't sure if there was a conclusion slide or not, but that is the end of this item. So Commissioner Lamb, over to you. Thank you.
Ms. Koska, can we see if there's any public comment?
Yes. I believe there is one speaker,
Okay.
Beth Kelly.
Let's do up to 90 seconds, please.
Yeah, no problem. I just want to acknowledge that that is a super heavy lift. And then I know that there can't be any back and forth, but I'm curious as to the trends on enrollment. Thanks.
Ms. Costco, I think that concludes
Yes,
public comment.
I believe so.
For commissioners, are there any additional questions? We've got a busy few weeks. I know the budget team's been working, not that you all have stopped working hard, but thank you all. Look forward to the coming weeks. So this time we'll shift into our next agenda item, which is our standing item of the school reopening update. Chief Wallace, you're gonna walk us through. Yes.
Sorry, before we segue, could we sort of fill in the missing date or the date that was referred to for the enrollment
Yes, please.
discussion? So our team was proposing the June 2nd committee meeting to share back some information about enrollment trends.
Do you want a confirmation if we would do it on the June 2nd?
Well, I think we would defer to you as chair, Commissioner Lamb, but just we, as Ms. Gordon mentioned, that was something that in our thinking we were aware of, and I know there have been a lot of interest in that topic. So we did want to work on a staff report. So if you're comfortable with that, commissioners, then we will work on that towards the next meeting.
Yes, please. That'll be a day after we submit to CDE, right? Our education recovery plans.
We're probably going to submit our plan early because the board action will take place on the 25th, on May 25th.
Yes, we look forward to those enrollment numbers and updates. Thank you. So we will now shift into the school reopening update. Chief Wallace.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Lamb. Sophie, Mike, I see. Yeah. So I can, just while we're transitioning to the next slides, I just want to give a little bit of context that this is a standing item, that here we are in the thick of reopening. We've got our various waves open. And the context of this standing item is to provide an update on the current year anticipated costs of reopening our schools. Thank you. This is the correct slide. Would it be, may I ask, there may be future slides that will get cut off. Is it possible to put this in a presentation mode? Excellent, thank you. Perfect, thank you. So we want to look at both the current year costs for reopening schools, as well as looking ahead for next year and considering the various funding strategies and the trade-offs that we should be keeping our eyes on. Next slide, please. To begin, in the current year, you may recall from the second interim report that we are managing a remaining $4.3 million COVID-19 reserve. So these are funds that are unallocated except for the purpose of allowing us to address our needs under the pandemic, be it reopening schools or providing distance learning supports. In this particular case, because now we're up and running with starting to reopen our schools, there are a series of expenses that are new and that we're trying to monitor the needs and expenses associated with bringing kids back. So you can see, actually, we've provided low and high estimates. And I think that's really important because we're dealing with a lot of variables at this point in time. The substitute teachers is one of the first great examples of kind of uncertainty, although we're getting into a higher degree of certainty of how many teachers we would need to bring into the classrooms as substitutes to accommodate teachers who have had to continue with teaching in a distance learning model due to accommodations, health concerns, and the like. So in prior reports, we'd anticipated that this cost could be as much as $3 million, but we're starting to get a better handle on the cost estimates, and now we're estimating that it will be about $2 million. The COVID testing continues to be a bit uncertain, primarily because we're hoping that there will be additional federal funds flowing our way that can help offset this cost. So again, this table shows our use of our reserve. So if we had additional funds come in, we would shift these costs over, but the high cost is, we're anticipating is about $5 million. That's how much the board approved in our contract with Color to do our testing. We've also been providing aftercare to some schools for the Wednesday early release dates. These costs have come down a bit now that we understand exactly which schools will be providing those services. And then costs for ventilation and translation, those are pretty much fixed, although we are starting to hear from our Chief Facilities Officer that there may be additional costs coming in for ventilation improvements, particularly for our high schools. So the main thing to point out is the high is more than our available reserve. But the good news is that we have received our first tranche of ESER 2 funding. So that second federal stimulus bill that was approved in December, we do have a portion of those funds available. And if necessary, we will draw down from those to help us close out the fiscal year. But what I should be pointing out is that we've assumed that these funds would help us cover costs in fiscal year 21-22. So to the extent that we can control these costs, we'll have more funding to help support next year's operations. Next slide, please. So looking ahead to next year, I think it's important, again, to look at scenarios. I should probably come up with better titles than bad and better, but really it's the worst, dealing with those different scenarios, I think helps us all understand just the different paths we may head down. And the main thing that I want to highlight here is that we really are benefiting tremendously from these one-time funds. You can see in both of these scenarios, we had started off with $100.2 million and then a $112.1 million deficit for these next two fiscal years ahead of us. But the federal stimulus dollars in ESER 2 and ESER 3 are more than addressing that shortfall. Nonetheless, as we're going through our budget development, we're looking for opportunities to just be smart about our budgeting, looking at our available sources and thinking how we might be able to put current expenses that are on unrestricted sources onto more restricted sources. So we are looking at Prop J, wanting to talk with our labor partners about how to use those funds possibly to cover some of our operating expenses. We've talked about the learning recovery dollars that we have a lot of great ideas of new ways to spend those funds, but we also already provide services to our students in ways that can be addressing the learning recovery needs align with those funding sources. So we're looking at ways possibly using those funds to cover current operations. And so here's just a scenario where you can see in either case, we would be ending the year with a positive balance. But we do know that there are going to be some ongoing costs related to reopening schools under COVID-19. Yes, we're moving to yellow, improving our outlook. with regard to the pandemic, but we are continuing to consider additional costs like custodial supports at sites, maybe some ongoing demand for testing, other capital improvements. We continue to look at our school sites and know that there are improvements that can be made to ventilation or creating outdoor spaces. And then we're continuing to talk with staff about the need for additional staff on site to help reduce class sizes or possibly support, just new accommodations of reducing the number of students in a class. And we know that there's some demand for distance learning for students who have actually done really well under distance learning. So these are just estimates, but wanting to show that these types of expenses would further draw down our available sources. And then the final scenario, or the final layer within our scenarios, is looking at other potential sources that could be coming on board. I'm working with the city to examine FEMA, understand if it's possible to bring in more FEMA dollars to cover the cost of custodians, or as I mentioned, the COVID testing. And then now we believe we're eligible for our state in-person learning grant. Sorry, this actually understates it. We're anticipating that we would be eligible for $12.5 million. So in all of those cases, we could possibly, in that better scenario, actually have a balance at the end of the year that could be reserved and set aside to help address the fiscal year 22-23 deficit. So I'll continue to show this in terms of the types of trade-offs that we have, really trying to control our costs, but of course invest where we need to, particularly in order to support health and safety of our students and staff. But again, to the extent that we're able to stretch the use of these one-time dollars to help cover that second year, it'll help us in that overall budget balancing plan. So that's all I have on this item. Happy to answer any questions.
Before we go to public comment, if there are any clarifying questions from commissioners? Commissioner Alexander.
Thanks, Chief Wallace. I really love the bad and better, actually. I think that's great. I was wondering if you could just clarify for the public and us, as we think about the structural deficit, why does it go up from 100 million to 112 million? I mean, I can make some assumptions, but just so like, is it increasing every year? And does that make sense?
Yes. So one of the primary drivers is simply just the cost of doing business goes up every year. We inflate salaries by 1% just to allow for step and column that any individual in their current role, their salary increases just because they've gained experience, and we've structured our salaries in that way. Also, our benefits increase proportionally in many ways, right, to those given salaries. Our pension costs are a critical driver there. So the percentage of a salary that gets set aside for pension also increases every year. So it's just an ever-growing outlook when it comes to personnel costs. We all know that that's doing business, and that goes for non-personnel as well, that we've built in inflation on our, anything from utilities. Those tend to be a pretty high inflation of say 7%, whereas everything else rises with general, percentage increases of between, anywhere between 1.5% to 3%, depending on what the current economic outlook is. And then the other factor I should highlight is assumptions around funds declining, one-time funds going away. looking ahead to 22, 23, we actually know that we do actually have some fund balance assumed in our 21-22 budget, that will be fully drawn down from our PEEF baseline. Actually, I should probably just give a presentation on the PEEF baseline. But anyway, all of these things come together. We're looking at both expenditure growth and changes in our revenue that creates that significant jump.
Thank you. Ms. Costco, let's open up to public comment.
I see absolutely no speakers to this item, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. I had a follow-up comment or question there, commissioners. I'll open up to you all first if there's any dialogue or you'd like to share questions. Okay, seeing none. Megan, I'm curious around the FEMA reimbursements. I know that there's been some lag and kind of, best case scenario, right, of drawing back down those dollars or getting those reimbursements back to SF Unified. Do you have a sense of what that timing might be, or, how we may have to make adjustments there if they don't come in at the pace that we're projecting?
Yeah. Actually, the window is narrowing. I believe that, we're eligible for FEMA reimbursement as long as there's been determined a state of emergency. So at the federal level, I hesitate to say the deadline because I would need to double check it, but we are approaching the end of that window of eligibility. I would say that the biggest factor on us being able to obtain FEMA dollars is really our partnership with the city. They've been trying to help connect us with the right partners at FEMA, and they're very much experts at recovering from that agency. But I would say that getting education-based expenses is a bit of a plot twist for them. So we're just continuing to partner with them. It's honestly just staff bandwidth. We're dealing with a variety of things. And so that's one of the things that I just need to come back around with it's the city's cost recovery team has been, really eager to engage with us and support us. But we need to get each other's attention again and pick the conversation back up. But I would say that if we're not able to make traction on it by this summer, it's a possibility it's not an eligible source of funds for us.
Got it. So I look forward to getting kind of updates from you and the team around that progress, because I know that would really alleviate to bringing those dollars back to the district. A couple other inquiries. I know with CDC and the ever-changing public health guidelines, for example, even the shift of, cleaning services and kind of the cadence, right, of maintenance and cleaning. So I guess we would anticipate seeing some shifts there as well, right, with the health and safety pieces. And I think if, even a few months ago, our thought around projections of custodian was much higher, but it sounds like that might be shifting in the coming months.
Yeah, actually, I can add a comment to that we are working with the facilities team to understand what the real need is there. We've had a placeholder of a pretty high expense of $10 million. I would anticipate that we need at least some of that just to make sure we're meeting our baseline level of cleaning. Our facilities team has learned a lot about what it, really looked closely at our facilities and done assessments of the ongoing need. So I would dare to say that some of that budget is likely ongoing as an additional expense. Just that we've identified a $10 million cost for addressing COVID-19, but what the facilities team is actually saying that some of that really is necessary to meet a higher level of of cleaning that should be sustained in the long run. So we're trying to pull apart what is ongoing and what's really necessary for this one-time purpose.
Thank you. And I have one other comment before I go to Vice President Moliga. It's related, and I, completely understand and appreciate the budget team. You're really looking at, what are our current operations of funding, let's say particularly around our education recovery dollars and funding that can be leveraged, right? Both what's already built into what we're doing that would be qualifying for ESSER or for the state recovery dollars. I think what would be helpful for me is to understand, because I'm sure all eyes are also on districts right now, right, around what are going to be, quote, new programming or enhancements, education enhancements because of the recovery. I think that would also be helpful to see through the different scenarios around what pieces of that will go to accelerated learning or pieces there that we're going to need to demonstrate our impact, similar to what's going to be, submitted to the state on those plans, and then our quote actuals and impact. So love to be able to work with you, Chief Wallace, and the budget team around what that might look like in the coming months of how we report that out to the board and to the public overall.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that. I think that as we bring forward the plan, it'll sort of set the groundwork of what the report looks like, what will we need to report back to the state on, what is this body and the public interested in keeping tabs on as we move forward. So yeah, I look forward to that discussion because I think it's really exciting to have this resource, or I should say resources, right? It's both the federal, state, and the federal dollars, and so we should definitely be keeping clear tabs on it in order to meet our obligations with the state and federal governments, but definitely also wanting to think about what kind of information you all would like to hear on an ongoing basis when we're bringing those reports back.
And just to note, I know that the governor just today is making some announcements prior to his May revise officially coming out on Friday. I am sure the team has not had the time, a moment of breath to breathe to do that analysis, but just to also put forward to, commissioners and to the public that is definitely, we understand and have that eye on those new investments, and we'll see how that gets worked out between the governor and the state legislature in the coming weeks. But that also is exciting because it is clear from Governor Newsom that he is particularly interested in really, quote, reimagining public education, providing supports for our students in new ways that the state of California has invested in the most recent years. So, and really that's grounded in the education recovery and our overall recovery from the pandemic. So look forward to that deeper dive analysis, bringing that back to how that impacts us locally as a school district. So with that, I'd like to shift to Vice President Moliga.
Thank you, Chair Lamb. I am too also excited about the governor's announcements in terms of his future plans for education, and I'm looking forward to the updates. I had a question around ventilations, Chief Wallace, and I wanted to ask, I asked this earlier with staff about the, because it seems like we're getting ready to fund that through the current dollars that we have, but what I was wondering was the school energy efficiency stimulus program. I'm wondering if you are all familiar with the program, and if you are, how come we haven't tapped into that program? Because the program is out of Assembly Bill 841, and it's specifically to provide funding to upgrade heating, air conditioning, and ventilation systems in public schools, and also to replace non-compliant plumbing fixtures and appliances that fail to meet water efficiency standards. So I'm wondering if that's something that is available to us, and if it's something that we had an opportunity to tap into, or if it actually didn't meet what we were looking for. So I'm just curious, because from my understanding, I know other school districts have been doing it or have been enrolled in the program.
I'm definitely familiar with the funding source, but haven't been in direct conversations with our facilities team yet. We actually are meeting tomorrow to work through some of the final, details around reopening needs for the fall. So I'd love to raise that exact question and report back to you.
Yeah, I would appreciate it because it seems like based on some current reports that we've been receiving from staff that we're potentially preparing to put some investments into upgrading our HVACs or bring on new HVAC systems. And I think, if there's other pots out there we can tap into, for example, like Medi-Cal, right? We should definitely do it. So looking forward to the update. Thank you.
Commissioner Alexander.
Yeah, quick follow-up on that around the ventilation systems. I recall that back in, I believe it was 2018, Supervisor Ronan was calling for the city to equip our classrooms with air filtration systems. This was in response to the wildfires at the time. And so I'm curious whatever happened with that, because that came in the back of my mind as we were like dealing with ventilation this year. But I'm wondering, we were anticipating a big fire season again, and it might be useful to go back to the city as well around that. So I'm just curious, whatever happened with that proposal from Supervisor Ronan?
Comment a little bit on that, Commissioner. So this was back then, and I'm not actually completely clear on whether this has been revived, whether we've revived this conversation during the pandemic. But I did talk with Chief Kamalanathan about where that strand of discussion left off back in the time frame that you're mentioning. And my understanding is that when a cost assessment was completed or sort of attempted, at least a ballpark cost estimate, that the total investment for those for that equipment to be installed across the whole district was larger than I think the supervisor and many folks had initially estimated. And I'm just kind of off the top of my head recalling something in the $5 million range. And given that was a higher number or a higher ballpark estimate than maybe people had originally imagined, it was a little unclear where to seek that funding. So through the city's appropriations process. And so it was again, this is a little bit third hand, so forgive me if I sound a little tentative on this, but this is my understanding from Chief Kamalanathan that kind of reached a little bit of a pause or a cul-de-sac. And then on our side, there was also a question which I think to an extent remains true today in our team's mind or in our team's thinking, that there was a question about whether our electrical systems could bear, whether there was sort of confidence that they could reliably bear the additional load of that equipment being run constantly in every classroom. And I think that's still a concern on Chief Kamalanathan's part. And but for that, this would have been a good time for us to, revive those conversations with the supervisor's help or with other leaders in the city and county. But I think it was a kind of the combination of those two considerations that have I mean, we're not stuck. I don't want to characterize it as something that's stuck and that we've concluded that we shouldn't pursue. But there are some questions that are a little bit unresolved.
It feels like a great time to get a cost estimate on that. I would love to help advocate with the city if that's useful. And I think if it involves electrical work as well, I mean, I don't know what the capacity is. I mean, but our schools, our kids deserve and need healthy air. And I think as we both in terms of moving out of the pandemic and any lingering concerns about COVID, but also moving into a potential wildfire season, I think we really need to consider that. So anyway, please let us know if there's ways board members can support with that effort.
Can I just add on to that?
Go ahead, Commissioner Sanchez.
Thank you. We are planning on floating our next bond in 22, if that's still on. So that might be a discussion we have in facilities, building and grounds committee as well.
Yeah, I wanted to suggest that perhaps at buildings and grounds, when we do return to regular scheduled committee meetings. I think another aspect for the team was, in addition to just the cost analysis for the purifiers themselves, was also both the electrical piece, infrastructure wise at our school sites, but also the trainings that would also need to go in hand for supports. They go down, and educators and staff would need to be trained there, and then also building out the operations of replacements too. So I think that was the thought around understanding that full scale of that quote design overall beyond just the unit. Thank you. Right. Commissioner Malia, did you have a follow-up? Okay. Thank you. So at this time, I'd like to shift to our final item of the evening, which is our revenue updates, and it's going back to Chief Wallace.
Great, thank you, Chair Lamb. So this is also a standing item. I'm appreciating these standing items because it feels like a lot of things. It's important to note if things are changing or what new things came up, or different ways of presenting the information. And if I may request the final slides. So the purpose of this.
We're putting it on shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. But I'll just go ahead and share that the objective of this item is next slide, please.
No.
So a little part. Yep. Next one.
I think it might be the wrong. I think this is the
last.
last.
It is, yeah, I think it is the wrong.
Yeah.
We're finding it momentarily, please.
So the objective of this item is to keep the Budget and Business Services Committee and the public updated on revenue strategies for addressing the district's structural budget deficit. I know that there's been a lot of news going on today, as was mentioned previously. The governor is starting to share information about exciting revenue outlooks for the state budget. I'll just go ahead and give a disclosure up front that hasn't been built into this presentation as of yet. So I anticipate that the June presentation will be chock full of that exciting information. Thank you, Ms. Casco. So if I may have the next slide, please. Thank you. So we are covering a bit of, providing an update on federal, state, and local dollars. And when I mentioned about things not necessarily changing, but wanting to give different ways of presenting it, I realized that we never really provided just a nice bite-sized version of our federal funding. You've seen line items and ESER 2 and ESER 3, ESER 3 learning recovery paired with the state funding on learning recovery. But I wanted to give a snapshot of just the federal funding, so you felt like you could get your arms around that particular source of funds. So all together, it's almost $139 million between these the two stimulus packages. As mentioned before, ESER 2 includes $43 million for our district, whereas ESER 3 is 95.9. So within the ESER 3 funding, we've talked about how 80% of that can be used for general purposes for school districts, whereas 20% must be set aside for learning recovery, or $19.2 million for learning recovery. And so between the ESER 2 funds and the general use of ESER 3, that is $119.7 million for the general purpose of preventing, preparing for, and responding to COVID-19 and ensuring continuity of services. And I want to emphasize that last bit of ensuring continuity of services, because as you look down this list of eligible uses, they are very much in line of things that we have been doing to support our students and our communities during the pandemic. But one might ask, how is it then we can use these funds to help close our budget deficit? And that's where I want to call your eyes down to that final bullet that says other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation and continuity of services and continue the employment of existing staff. That's my line item, because I'm like, all right, we have flexibility to address our operational needs at this time, that if we were to try to realign our budget at this point in time, that would require layoffs in a district that is mostly funding staff. And so that's why we really want to emphasize the general use eligibility of the federal funds versus the learning recovery, which you can see really is in line with the state funding. The next slide, I'll go back over the state funds that are available for learning recovery, but oh, sorry, not just yet. Thank you. But this is much more restricted, and we will need to be able to report back on how these funds are being used for line items that align with the items listed here. Oh, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so then we're looking at AB 86, the state funding, and to help incentivize and support reopening of schools. And as you'll recall, SFUSD is eligible for up to $17.8 million to provide in-person instruction no later than May 15th. However, as you're familiar, the amount of funds that a district is eligible for declines by 1% for each instructional day between April 1st and May 15th. And I'm excited to say that we believe that we are eligible for these funds, that we are working to open schools for our seniors, which would give us eligibility for $12.5 million given the timeline. So not the full 17.8, but we are within that window to be able to receive those funds. And then in addition to that, we're eligible for the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant, or ELO or ELOG. You're going to hear any of those. And that is what we covered at our recent Committee of the Whole meeting, and staff will be bringing to the full board meeting on May 25th. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the state and federal funds combined. And so we will, while the reporting requirements of these two different funding sources will be different, we anticipate that staff will be managing these funds alongside one another, just particularly noting that the federal funds have a longer shelf life than the state funds. So we are considering that timing and wanting to be sure that we spend down the state dollars first. Next slide, please. So with this, I actually want to hand it over to Deputy Superintendent Lee.
Thank you, Megan. So commissioners, we just have 2 more slides to go. And these both have to do with revenue updates from the city and or other miscellaneous sources. So I know in the past, the committee has raised the question of the SF RISE working group. And so we have a little bit of information to report about that. So that's the Student and Family Recovery with Inclusive and Successful Enrichment working group. And that's pursuant to the legislation that I know you all are aware of, that Supervisors Ronan and Melgar introduced earlier this spring, and that the full board of supervisors approved and then the mayor signed. So, and there are links in this slide to the legislation and a summary of the legislation. So just to recap, the objective, the goal is to maximize support for San Francisco youth, especially SFUSD youth, whose experiences academically and in other respects have been hindered by the pandemic. So the legislation, as we've discussed before, calls for a working group to convene and prepare a plan in August or by August to the full board of supervisors, the mayor and the district around services to youth and families. And we're happy to share that the first meeting of the working group took place last Thursday, May 7th. And there are 11 members of the working group, and SFUSD is represented by 2 of those 11 members. Commissioner Bogus is the Board of Education appointee, and Jill Hogendijk, the district's chief of staff, is the second appointee, and she is appointed by Dr. Matthews, the superintendent's appointment. And I'll also mention that my understanding of the timeline for the working group may extend a bit past August 1st. I believe they are intending to prepare a report sometime in August. That's really focused on assessing or summarizing the needs that have emerged and that have become clearer during the past year and a half, and also engaging the community and identifying promising practices that could be expanded or scaled up or deepened through investments that will hopefully be made possible by aspect of the overall effort. And then the last slide just includes a few different points. One is that the city and county approved a large supplemental appropriation package. This was in March, and through the leadership of Supervisor Haney, who is the budget chair, working closely with Mayor Breed and her team to come up with, I believe it was a total package of $125 million of funds in a supplemental appropriation for various needs of our community, made possible by better than expected improvements in the city and county's budget. And that includes 2 appropriations or 2 elements that are specifically important for us. One is a $15 million appropriation for Summer Together. I believe you're all quite familiar with that. And this is the package of in-person opportunities for SFUSD students across various different programs, different providers. And if funds remain unspent after this summer, they can be utilized for needs that are identified through the RISE SF, the SF RISE working group. And speaking with Supervisor Ronan, there are also a number of other funding opportunities that are currently being pursued. And then in that supplemental appropriation package, there was also a $2.7 million appropriation to support dual enrollment in City College and to expand summer internships for our high school students that are in our CTE pathway exploring education careers. And do want to note that that Commissioner Collins and Supervisor Marr were very instrumental in advocating for that second appropriation, that $2.7 million appropriation for those two programs, again, working with Supervisor Haney and Mayor Breed. And then finally, this is not related to, in the same way, to a city appropriation, but also involves the city. Litigation in the Prop G matter is still pending in the Court of Appeal, and oral arguments are expected to be scheduled soon. We reported, I think, the same thing at last month's committee meeting. So we're still in a waiting pattern of waiting for those oral arguments to be set. And then I think all eyes, as previously mentioned, are on the state budget for 21-22, as Commissioner Lamb and Chief Wallace mentioned. There are some pretty big announcements happening, including today, and the governor's May revision proposal will be released in full on Friday. And then over the following month, the legislature will take have their hearings and present proposals, and ultimately there will be a budget that's supposed to be signed by the enacted by the legislature by June 15th. So as Chair Lamb mentioned, we're continuing into a busy spring, and this is a lot of revenue questions will become clear in the next month as well. So with that, I think that's it for our presentation. So pass back to you, Commissioner Lamb.
Thank you. I know that we have a couple of minutes before we hit 6 o'clock. Seeing if there's any public comment this time.
Yeah, there are no one hand just went up. Julie Roberts Fung, please.
Okay, let's do 90 seconds, please.
90.
Hi, thank you for the update. I'm curious, Deputy Superintendent Lee, if you could give us a reminder about the status of the Prop J funds and the agreement that was made with the city. So my understanding is that when Prop G passed, it sort of supplants Prop J, but that there's funds that have been held in escrow. And I don't remember if the city is expecting SFUSD to shift some of those dollars back to the city based on their ERAFs, our money that they gave some of back to us through ERAF, or whether we will be able to use the balance of the Prop J dollars in escrow for SFUSD purposes. And I'm wondering if you can update us on the amount of funding there. Thank you.
Ms. Costco, does that conclude public comment?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you. So this time, commissioners, do you have any questions around the revenue update or clarifications? Okay. Seeing none, that concludes our revenue, our standing informational items for this evening. As we were mentioned, reminded, we have a really busy month as we close into putting forward our budget to be adopted by the board. And what we know is going to be a very heavy lift for the next fiscal year, and that's really going to be the zero-based budgeting, landing on confirmations around our revenues, both at the federal and state levels in the coming months. And thank you to the team so much for the work and the thoughtful and detailed presentations. So I will adjourn this Budget and Business Services meeting tonight. Thank you all.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Staff.